feel guilt.
Mm.
If I see the good in you, I can idolize you and think you're better than human.
Mm.
And if I can see the good in myself, I become prideful and
Right.
think I'm better than someone else. So these are the real destructive elements of that knowledge, the things that really pull us down then and give us the root of suffering. And for me, I don't know much about theology this way, but for me, the bringing up of Jesus into the world, this idea is that this is the salvation from that suffering.
Right.
Is this character who says, hey, we're all screwed. So let's forgive each other.
Right. And let's
You know
help
what I
each
mean?
other
Let's
and love
help
each other.
Yeah.
And that way you get to eat from the tree of life.
Right.
The Christian symbolism is that the real tree is the tree of life, which is what we're supposed to be eating from, which sustains and nourishes and is non-judgmental and is loving. And that's what Christians believe, was Christ's teaching. Interestingly, going back to what I was saying about the Kabbalah, the oral traditions, that's what the Kabbalah is based on, the motif of the tree of life, which is both a Jewish and a Christian thing. Because Jesus was working, I think, within an esoteric Jewish tradition, which knew this stuff, proto-Kabbalah. And so he was talking from spirit rather than letter. And that transcending that judgmentalism is part of that.
Can I ask you a question
Sure,
about, now that we've gotten to the idea of Christianity, and I've heard that Mary and Joseph were Essene Jews. The parents of, or the people who raised Jesus were Essene Jews, that was a mystical tradition among Judaism. Is that your experience? Do you understand it that way?
Well, the word Essene was used by Philo, who came from Alexandria. He called them also Therapeutae, which was a particular group of Jews. Therapeutae meaning the healers. And there were different schools of Judaism in the time of Jesus. And they all were in different factions and vying for power and so on. The Essenes, or the Therapeutae, seem to have been the ones who'd gone on retreat and who'd gone on the internal journey. They were, if you want, the hippies of the day, who'd said, no, we're going to go and live in a commune and find spirituality as a lived experience. So scholars have found at Qumran, one of these communities, and they've found the scriptorium, the library they used, and they had a whole load of very interesting Gnostic, like the books of Enoch there. They were quite into angelology. So the Essenes believed that angels, sort of transcendental intelligences, can be picked up by us humans, and they can affect us for the good.
I'd heard that in that context, that Joseph, when he was told by an angel, no, Mary didn't screw around. This is Jesus. This is God's child.
Right.
That he was able to accept that because he was an Essene.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. The other thing, just to say from my own studies, which kind of balances this, is that when Mary and Joseph had, when the baby Jesus was born, and Herod was after him, the Gospels state that they took him to Egypt for safety. Now that indicates that Joseph and or Mary had contacts, family, friends, relations in Egypt, which is very interesting because it was in Egypt that the most advanced schools of Judaism were interpreting the spiritual depths of Judaism. Philo was teaching there, and he'd written about the Bible to be read allegorically, and he'd married up esoteric Judaism with Platonism, because Plato had taught that the ancient myths are to be read allegorically and mystically, and that they have a didactic purpose, a moral purpose. So Philo was a Platonic Jew who totally at home with Hellenistic philosophy, but also with Judaism, as was much later Maimonides, the greatest philosopher of Judaism, right, in like 13th century Spain and Egypt. And so the word the name Jesus was quite common in Egyptian Judaism. One of the greatest books of the Old Testament is called the Wisdom of Sirach, ascribed to someone called Jesus. And if you read these wisdom writings of sort of latter Jewish writings, you'll find lots of echoes to Christ's teachings when he gets up and does the Sermon on the Mount and he's going around Galilee, he's speaking a kind of Alexandrian Judaism, which is saying, don't go for the letter, go for the spirit. Don't go for the literal meaning, go for the symbolical, allegorical meaning. And so, in a sense, Alexandria was the California of that day. Anyone that went there and got educated there had a breadth of vision and a depth of compassion that wasn't in the kind of, mainstream, normal, hidebound literalist schools. So that's where I would say, and other writers and people who've researched the matter in great depth have said this. I discovered recently the German ambassador to London in the 19th century, in the time of Queen Victoria, was an amazing man called Bunsen, Chevalier Bunsen. And he was a profound student of ancient Egyptian philosophy and literature, a learned man, right? Friend of the King of Prussia and of Queen Victoria. And Bunsen and his son wrote about esoteric philosophy and things. And his son wrote a book about the wisdom of Christ, in which he says, it's obvious Christ, was educated in Egypt. But Bunsen actually influenced Florence Nightingale to become a nurse.
Wow.
Because she didn't know what to do. She was kind of wealthy, talented. He said, why don't you go into nursing? Which is where we have the modern nurses movement from.
Wow.
So what I'm interested in history, and that's why it's been fascinating talking to you, is the traces of spirit in action. So when I look at someone like Bunsen's life and the influence somebody like that has on someone like Florence Nightingale and all the good that came from that, and you can trace it back to the faith that man had. And then you look at, say, Christ, jumping back in time, where did that energy come from? I think these are great souls that come into the world from generation to generation, and it's true. And I mean, the whole thing about suffering, I think they're there to teach us that beyond suffering there is the possibility of peace,
Right.
and redemption. Can I just ask, just coming
Sure.
towards the end of our little chat, about your interest in Aikido, which is one of the things you've been sharing here at the castle, because Japan went through a very martial phase when it got into imperialism and it invaded China and did some horrible things in Korea and stuff. There's a very martial element in Japanese culture, isn't there?
Right.
And the Americans, felt the full force of that in the Pacific and the attack on Hawaii and things.
Right.
And yet there's a peaceful side to Japanese culture, isn't there? And where does Aikido fit into that dualism?
Well, I kind of think it's like anything else. You have Christianity with this great tradition of the head of that lineage, that teacher who started that the movement was formed around, preaching nothing but love and inclusion, and then the things that were done in the name of that were just atrocious. So I think that when World War II was happening, O-sensei was forced into teaching like the Japanese equivalent of the Gestapo, martial arts. And Suna Damari, who was one of my teachers in Aikido, was a young man from the Emoto religion who came to Aikido through spirituality, who was kind of put in this position of actually teaching Aikido to barbarians, who were mostly interested in how do I use this to dominate someone else? How do I use these movements to kill somebody? Not, how do I make the world a better place with this?
Right. This is during the war itself.
Exactly. And then after the war, from what I've read from Ueshiba's son, there was a great humiliation in having lost. So martial arts became very unpopular. And not only were they very unpopular, but the occupying Allied troops were putting a limit on anybody doing any kind of martial art.
Okay.
So Aikido was happening on a very, very small scale in a little dojo with children. The teachers of the students that O-sensei taught were kids. Like the translator of the book Aikido, our friend Kaz Tanahashi, who was introduced to me by Joan Halifax, was a child.
Right.
He
So they were
was a
seen as
post-war
safe
story.
by the occupying forces.
Well, it just was underground. Nobody really saw it. It wasn't publicized.
Right.
And then as things came out of there, that was also, Sensei was looking at things a little differently then. So and his roots were the Emoto Kyo, which was an offshoot of Shintoism, but not quite Shintoism. And I really don't know much about the difference, but I do know that I was informed by one of Tsunedamari's students when I was in Japan that Emoto Kyo had also evolved into Seicho no I, which is something my wife and I became involved in when we met a young Japanese woman who was doing kiatsu massage that she'd learned from the head of my Aikido lineage, Koichi Tohei. So there are these connections in there that are really interesting to me. And the Seicho no I doesn't ascribe to any specific dogma. They look at all these different religions and find the truth in them all and bring them all up as equals.
Yeah.
They go beyond the dogma and use the dogma to explain things within different dogmas. So
can I just comment on that? There's something I've really admired about the Japanese mind when I've gone into it. I knew a Japanese professor of peace studies who he went to Hiroshima with his wife. He was then an English lecturer, professor of English studies, and he had a supernatural experience. He heard the dead speaking to him. And they told him to stop studying English and teach peace studies, change his career path. So he did. And he's like, one of my colleagues over in Japan. Now, something he taught me is that for the ordinary Japanese person, syncretism is not a problem. Like, when you get married, you tend to do it in a Shinto temple. When you have a funeral and you die, you tend to go to a Buddhist one. You'll adopt kind of elements of Western thought. And the more I looked into the history of Japanese philosophy as a philosopher, in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the greatest Japanese philosophers took a bit